Now it's time to think about the worlds in our own head. And here to talk about it is Jacob Robinson.
Thank you so much, Melissa. All right, thank you all, and thanks for the opportunity to come here today. When I first got this email from Max and Mallory, after I convinced myself this wasn't a scam, I was like, what story can I tell here? And there's actually a story that I had been wanting to tell, and this was an opportunity for me to try to think about if I could do this. And I didn't know it was going to be like this kind of audience, so I'm questioning my decisions now. But I picked this story in part because it's uncomfortable for me, which is weird because it's normally my favorite subject, which is myself. Here I am in 1987, 5 years old, strapping young man. And one day my mom dropped me off at a friend from church's house. And she said she was going to come back later that day to pick me up. And she came back 20 days later. And one of the weirder parts of this story is that during that time, I wasn't like crying and asking where my mom was. I was like, it's like kind of normal for me. And that was really strange to the person who was watching me, but that was the kind of uncertainty and instability that I had just become accustomed to at that age. As an adult, this is actually it's been really interesting for me to reflect back because I think that experience has affected a lot of who I am and the decisions that I have made going forward. And there's a lot of anger actually now, like my mom, like, how the heck could you do that? And I realized that some of that anger is probably misplaced because she also didn't have the kind of childhood that she deserved. This was her in 1962. She left home before she graduated from high school, in part because she experienced instability in her household as well. This is my grandfather standing behind her. He suffered from schizophrenia. And because of that kind of dynamic that she grew up in, as an adult, she developed ADHD, depression, and then as a single mom suffering from those mental health conditions, trying to raise a 5-year-old on her own was incredibly hard for her. She couldn't hold down a job. And I, as an adult, have developed some of the same mental illness as my mom had as she was trying to raise me, partly because of probably my background, my genetics, as my experiences as well. And now I've got kids. And one of the things that probably worries me the most is what kind of life are they going to have? Is their life going to be a little bit harder for no fault of their own, but just because they were born into a family that happened to have a history of mental illness? And I did it. I tell this story here because we don't talk about these things a lot, and I think there probably is not a person in this room who hasn't been personally affected by mental illness. Probably not a story exactly like this, but you probably have your own stories. And if it's not you, it's a close friend or a loved one. And the reason why we know that is likely true is it's in the data. If we ask kids today, ages 14 to 17, they say things like, I can't do anything right. I don't enjoy life. My life is not useful. This is nearly half of kids. These are high school kids. And I'm flabbergasted by this data. I was talking to Jeff about, and he actually mentioned it yesterday. In many ways, undeniably, we live in the most advanced civilization this planet has ever known. We're surrounded by amazing things. In almost every way, our lives is getting better, but our mental health is not getting better. It is getting worse. And so then the question is, what the heck is happening? Why? One reason is that our brains have not evolved to live in the world that we find ourselves in, right? Yesterday, I had robotic bees showing me where to eat dinner. This is a remarkable society that we find ourselves in, but on an evolutionary timescale, we don't change that quickly. Each tick mark here is 1 million years. And so we can see over that period of time, the shape of the skulls change, and that reflects changes in our own brains, right? We've evolved over time when we begin to cook our food, or we hunt in packs, we have higher caloric diets. And if those changes happen slowly, our brains can evolve to make sense of that. But if we zoom in on just the last like 2,000 years, it's basically just a tick mark, and we've gone from building pyramids to building iPhones. Right? That is a blink of an eye in an evolutionary timescale, but the way that we live, communicate, fall in love, harvest grain or whatever, these things have changed dramatically. And so what do? We are not really evolved to live in today's world. I'll tell you what I did. I got like as far away as possible from dealing with like humans and their emotions and complicated things like that. And so I became a physicist. This is me in my physics lab as a graduate student doing physics things, smoking pipes, looking at lasers. I am not wearing laser safety goggles. I know that the laser is off at this point, so don't get me in trouble. And part of the reason why is there was like safety in that environment, because we could all get together and define the inputs to our systems. We could measure outputs. There were rules and equations and mathematics that explained dynamics in a way that I never felt like I had that in kind of social interactions, right? At home, I felt like we all had the same inputs. Outputs, very, very different, right? But there was probably a part of me that was kind of searching for that structure in math that I felt like I didn't have in kind of humanity. And then there was one day when, as I was finishing my PhD, this is at Cornell, they had hired a new faculty member who described the brain as a circuit. And for me, this was like an aha moment. I was like, I study circuits. Like, I feel like that makes sense. That's tangible. That's math. Human behavior didn't feel like math, but maybe there would be a way for us to use math, engineering, and physics to help us understand and maybe potentially regulate things that I perceived as being unregulatable, like human emotion, experience, mental health. Now, I was freshly off of my PhD in physics, and I was like, the answer is simple, right? Let's just solve the brain with science. So I went and I was trying to find a lab that would like let me do that, even though I knew nothing about neurobiology. As you can tell when I said that, you can tell I know nothing about neurobiology. If anybody says like I can solve the brain with science, no, it is hard. But there was a lab that I found at Harvard of all places. They're like, oh yeah, you want to solve the brain with science? Come over here. So I found this group and I began to take that opportunity to blend engineering and science, engineering and neurobiology together. So here I began to do like simple things, like we grew neurons on electronic devices, and we had this interface now. There was actually living brain cells and electrical circuits, and I began to understand how I might be able to do that. I wanted to do more than just grow cells on a dish, though. I really understand like human interaction and human behavior. So I started a faculty position after my postdoc at Rice, and I really built a neurotechnology lab with the goal of being able to build those engineering devices that would help us manipulate neural circuits. Now, as I alluded to earlier, I'm like super naive doing all of this, right? Like I have this vision, like circuits, no problem, we'll build the devices. But I was really lucky. I was lucky because the clinical science was beginning to advance at about the same pace as the technology. So I came to know John Nelson here, who was someone who had previously suffered from severe depression, treatment-resistant depression, failed multiple medications, failed electroconvulsive therapy multiple times, and was struggling to survive like each day, making it through without ending his own life. And he saw a clinical trial for an experimental brain surgery that could potentially help people with depression. He went through this procedure. It was a 9-hour brain surgery to implant electrodes about 6 inches deep. And actually, when I spoke to him afterward, he said that for him, he thought he might not wake up from this procedure because it looks terrifying. For him, that was like a respectable way out. But fortunately, he woke up and he's better. He got better actually very quickly, and he's better today He works with us at Motif. He helps me understand what it's like for someone making that kind of a decision. But I look at that, and we shouldn't wait until someone is like, I'm going to enroll in a clinical trial that might kill me. No, these people need help, and it shouldn't be this hard. We have to do something better. And as an engineer, I look at that, and I'm like, there's a lot of opportunity, right? There's a long ways from that to something that I think would be a device that everybody would potentially need or want. Now, we're fortunate again because as science continues to progress, what we've discovered is that for people with depression, like John, patterns of brain activity drive thoughts towards internal states of rumination. So that pattern of brain activity is, for him, inescapable. He can't stop thinking about the way that he feels, decisions he should have made. You ask him to, get out of bed, go take a shower, do those kinds of things, and he physically can't because he cannot direct his energy to the external world. That's a pattern of activity known as a default mode network. Now, what we know is that if we can stimulate the brain, we can drive it into a different pattern of activity. That's the pattern of activity that you kind of engage, and you're like, okay, I got to do my emails, I got to get up, I got to call my friends, like those kinds of things. There's a central executive network. It's a slightly different pattern of activity. And if we stimulate the different nodes in those networks, we can get people to be able to begin to engage in the world. So it's a central executive network, and there's actually multiple targets. One target was deep, and that was where the electrodes that were placed for John. But there's also targets on the surface of the brain, the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. I will hopefully never have to say that again. DLPFC is what I will say from now on. And if we stimulate DLPFC, people can get better. And we know this because of technologies like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. So TMS machines are basically these big magnets. They sit in a doctor's office, and they can direct enough energy to that cortical site to engage it. And we know that this is a real effective therapy for depression because we can look at the clinical outcomes. So the y-axis there is a depression score. This is a patient, it's a physician-initiated survey, so patient-reported outcomes. It's the best that we have right now for something like depression. I'll tell you, it can get better. 30 to 40 on that scale is very, very sick. So that's kind of probably where John was, where it's a struggle to get through each day. 10 is considered healthy, 10 and below. So you're like, we're not going for 0 because 0, like no one's 0. There's like something. Now, if we just pretend like the magnet is on, then people tend not to get better, right? It makes the noise, it sounds like it's working, we ask them how they're feeling, and nothing changes. It's called sham. Now, in the active group, when we turn it on, this is data coming out of Stanford. You can see 2022. This is actually the best data that I've seen. It was remarkable when I saw it. You can see they go from 30 to 40 down to about 10 in a week. These are people who hadn't responded previously to medication. Some people had failed electroconvulsive therapy. And that's remarkable. And these people, to enroll in this trial, many of them are sick for like more than 10 years. So the first time they're beginning to feel better, but you'll notice actually it starts to creep up a little bit. There's probably some eagle-eyed folks out there. Like around month 5, you start to see it come back up. And in fact, if we plot the percent of people that remain in remission over time, it falls off very dramatically. By 6 months, about half those people are sick again. And so in one way, it's a miracle. In one way, it kind of sucks. For the first time, they've tasted what it's like to be healthy again, and that's taken away from them in less than a year. But if those same people get retreated, so that's the first response there in purple, we give them a second response in orange, they get better again. So it's just a matter of being able to deliver the energy. So for me, as an engineer, the pieces started to fit together. I was like, look, there is a target in the brain that can help people get better. It's just a matter of delivering that energy reliably over time. That's an engineering device. That's a tool. Can we build it? And so what I imagined that tool would look like is not the deep brain stimulator that John had, but something that could be miniaturized, so small that it could avoid brain surgery altogether. If we could make something small enough to fit in the skull, then this could be an outpatient procedure, 20-minute outpatient procedure, never contacting or exposing the brain. I just need to have enough energy there to stimulate that same pattern of brain activity that we could with a TMS machine. But this was the problem. The problem is that that machine was gigantic, right? That's a lot of energy. I'm trying to pack it into something about the size of a pea. But this is also a physics problem. So now I'm excited because I'm like, okay, now I can finally take that physics education and see if I can build something. And in my lab, we looked at lots of different things to try to do this. And one day I was in my office and I got a manuscript to review that proposed to use these magnetoelectric nanoparticles. And this is kind of embarrassing. I was looking at that manuscript and I'm like, that is like not a word. I studied physics at Harvard. There's magnetism and there's electricity and this like that, you just made that up. And I'm gonna get you because I'm doing peer review. And as I was going through that manuscript, actually I was wrong. This is like a real material. The rest of the paper was not good, but there's a true story. I'm not gonna tell you who it was, but anyway, but it was really interesting because I was like, oh, I haven't heard of this before. Maybe there's something interesting here. The reason why I hadn't heard of it was that it's an incredibly rare material. So most materials either have magnetic polarizability or they have electric polarizability, usually not both. And in fact, there's almost no natural materials that have both of those properties. But the ones that do are called magnetoelectrics. And I want to show you how that works and then why that led to the breakthrough that allowed us to build it. I'll show you in a minute. So the way that we create these materials in my lab and now in my company is we take two different materials. One is a magnetostrictive material, so it has the magnetic properties. The other is the piezoelectric material, it has the electric properties. The magnetostrictive material, it vibrates when I turn on an alternating magnetic field. The piezoelectric material, as you're probably more familiar with, creates an electric field when it vibrates. And so if we can combine these two things together, I can apply an alternating magnetic field transferred into mechanical energy, which then creates an alternating voltage. I think it played, I wasn't paying attention. Now, there's a lot of smart people here, I've learned. You might be looking at this thinking that we already use magnetic fields to create electrical energy. I know. And that's magnetic induction, right? We use magnetic induction for the wireless power mats that you might have at home. We use it for actually every implantable medical device today is recharged using magnetic induction. Now, the way that magnetic induction works, I'm literally pausing because I know there's Nobel laureates here, but forgive me. The way that magnetic induction works is that you have a receiver coil, and we look at the magnetic field lines. Those are the horizontal white lines that I have going this way. A cross-section looks like little dots going through the board. And the magnetic flux is what determines how much energy I get from magnetic induction. That's me counting up every one of those field lines. Magnetoelectrics depends not on the flux, but on the strength. And the strength is the distance between those field lines, right? Now, what's special about magnetoelectrics is that if I make a very, very small device, I've given up all of those field lines. I've given up flux. So magnetic induction is not good. It's really bad at charging things that are small. But magnetoelectrics doesn't care about flux. It only cares about the strength. And so now you see like the strength is the same even though I've made a smaller device. So there's a fundamental difference in terms of the physics of how this scales that allows us now for the first time potentially to make a lot of energy inside of a small device. This is the first data that we got out of the lab. That top line is magnetic induction. The y-axis is the power transfer efficiency, or in other words, is how much energy I'm getting. The x-axis is the size of my receiver. So as it gets smaller towards zero, we really see that drop off in magnetic induction, and there's that crossing point with magnetoelectrics. And this might not look like much to you, but that little dot was really important for me because the magnetic induction line is based on Maxwell's equations. We basically optimized that over a century. And now for the first time, we've poked through that. And we poked through that with a material, which means that we can make better materials. I don't know what the best material is here, but I know that we can continue to make better ones. And in fact, unpublished data now, we've been able to 10x that amount of energy by using different materials. In our case, we switched the piezoelectric material out for something that had a higher mechanical quality factor, so it vibrates a little bit better. And I don't know how much better this is going to get, but this now is giving me that tool to build the thing that I wanted to do. And it's not just the power that is different, it's the reliability. So if you ever have a power mat at home and you're a little bit offset and your phone doesn't charge, I don't want that for my life-saving neural device. Because what our energy transfer is based on is magnetic flux, I'm not as sensitive ours is based on strength. I'm not as sensitive to those misalignments, so I can bend and tip and move it around and still get a lot of energy to that device. And so now these really are the pieces that I really wanted to be able to do for the first time you might be able to power a miniature device. And this is a rendering of what it is. It's very simple electronics combined with our materials, all encapsulated in polymer material. It's PEEK. It's the same materials that we use for cranioplasties or artificial hips. And then the electrodes themselves are just platinum iridium. You can see, like, it's embarrassing. I have the smallest demo, but it's here. And because it's this small, we can now do the procedure that I had hoped, where we can place a device into the thickness of the skull here. The brain itself is never exposed and never contacted. And so now this is an outpatient, roughly 20-minute procedure. Once it's placed, the device is controlled with an app. This purple represents that default mode network. This device then pairs with something to deliver the energy, which we put into a baseball hat. So all of the electronics that we need to communicate with the device is now paired with the hat, which hopefully, well, there it is. OK. Now, the patient just puts that hat on. It pairs with the implant, sends power, it sends digital data, and programs it with a pattern of stimulation that approximates what they did with the TMS machine. They control it here with an app, they push go or whatever, and you can see that electrical energy drives the central executive network so that patients then begin to be able to engage in the outside world again. Now, this is like my model and demo. As an experimentalist, I wanted to know that I had enough energy to actually make this a reality. So we thought of an experiment that would help me understand if we actually were driving brain networks. Now, we can't necessarily, in an acute setting, like a simple procedure, do this in the executive function center, because it's really hard to say, like, are you more executive functioning at this point in time? And we don't have FDA approval yet at the time to do this chronically. So we designed an experiment where we could place the device over the motor cortex. That's the part of the brain that causes movement. And we could do this in a human subject. I was at Rice, and so across the street is the largest medical center in the world, and I had clinical collaborators. I just had to wait for someone who was going through brain surgery and say, hey, like, we're working on this project. It's really important. Would you consent to a short study while you're having a tumor resected? So I had a couple of opportunities to go into the OR with a neurosurgeon. And then actually that day, it was someone I had never met. And I handed him my prototype, handed him that wand, that magnetic transmitter, and I'm like, I hope this all works, because I'm gonna feel like a jerk if I'm like slowing down someone's brain surgery, and I'm sitting there in the corner, and they turn it on, and for the first time I started to see this thumb twitch. And this thumb twitch meant that we're driving action potentials, we're engaging brain networks. This is the motor cortex, but if we take that same level of stimulation to the prefrontal cortex, our clinical target, that's the same amplitude that I needed. And this was the smallest implantable stimulator demonstrated in a human subject, and it was because we were finally able to solve the energy transfer problem. Now, I get even more excited when I think about the opportunities here, because this could be more than just a therapy. When you have a device treating something like mental illness, you have the opportunity to record data from the brain, the very organ that's responsible for your subjective experience. This is data that was published in Nature last year from colleagues and friends over at Georgia Tech and Emory. The y-axis, again, is this subjective clinician-initiated survey. It's been renormalized. But again, you see this horizontal line. That's considered healthy. This person was in remission, but they had an electrode kind of like John's that could record brain activity. They were doing really well, but then they relapsed, and they self-admitted to the hospital because they had tried to harm themselves. When they went back and they examined the brain data, they could build a classifier. And they built a classifier that could tell the difference between when the person was well and when they were sick, based just on the pattern of brain activity. From a single electrode, they looked at 2 different frequency bands, gamma and beta, if you're an expert. And what they found in that data was that prior to the self-admission, the brain activity pattern changed back to the pathological state, but it didn't change the day the patient went back to the hospital. It changed 5 weeks in advance. This was, for me, really shocking, but to the psychiatrists, they were not surprised, because when these people go to the hospital and they're interviewed, they often talk about the 1 or 2 weeks or 3 weeks before when they started to feel a little bit different, but they didn't know it was a major mental health episode until they were very, very sick. So the biology changes before we actually experience that phenotypical change. And we think about this, and I think about what could you do in those 5 weeks to prevent a hospital admission? Could we change the dose? Could we change medications, intervene, et cetera? And in fact, we should be working with mental health with that level of precision anyway. It's ridiculous that we can manage diabetes and everything else with quantitative measures, and we're still stuck with psychiatric surveys. That's going to change when we have devices. And it's not just depression. If we think about any mental health condition, these are all irregular patterns of brain activity: bipolar disorder, PTSD, anxiety. These are all dysregulated patterns of brain activity that can be re-regulated. And in fact, we are all constantly trying to regulate the pattern of brain activity. I do this every day, try to get more alert. And I do this with things that are safe and familiar, even if they don't always work very well, or if they have side effects or negative consequences. There are ways that we can help achieve focus and mental balance. And sometimes some of these things are actually hard. I cannot do almost anything. I can't sit cross-legged. There are ways that we can focus, but we're using technologies that are incredibly antiquated. But technologies can be just as safe and familiar. Technologies can also become safe and familiar, even if at first they look scary. So if you have a heart condition, we don't really think twice about pacemakers. We don't manage diabetes by asking how you feel after you ate a sandwich, right? We use technologies and they become just as safe and familiar as anything else that we interact with. And that happens with use. We are currently in the very early stages of exponential growth in terms of our understanding of how to use devices to regulate mental states. The number of clinical trials is doubling every 4.7 years, and since they developed things like transcranial magnetic stimulation about 20 years ago, we've 100x'd the number of clinical trials. That means we've 100x'd our understanding of how we can use devices to regulate mental states. I told you I had this background in physics and engineering, and I look at this and I see Moore's law. Right? I see the doubling of transistors. Right? Our doubling of number of clinical studies means that we are increasing the utility or the performance of neurotechnologies at the rate or a similar rate that we can increase the performance of compute. And where we are today at 100x is equivalent to roughly 1985 in the computer industry. If you remember what 1985 in the computer industry looked like, it was very different than today, right? There are people like this going around saying, like, there's going to be a computer everywhere. And people thought that that was strange and bizarre, right? It's really hard to understand what exponential growth looks like when it comes to changes in society. And that's where we are today when it comes to neurotechnology. We have devices today that help us communicate. In many ways, they help us live a better life. Why wouldn't we have devices that help us regulate mental health, something that's so incredibly important for us? And in fact, technology is the only thing that can move at the pace at which society around us is changing. So I am a tech optimist when it comes to this. I see a future in which we have these types of devices and the world can continue to grow, we can continue to experience this abundance, and we can be our best selves in it. But the thing that really drives me on a daily basis is the fact that, I started building things with science and physics, and we're going to start a clinical trial. In less than a year, these devices will be helping people get better again, and I can sit across from them. And I can see someone that's better because of something that we've built. And maybe these people have kids, Or maybe these people can be the kinds of parents that they've always wanted to be, and maybe their kids can grow up unburdened from the impacts of mental health. So thank you so much for the opportunity to come speak to you guys today. It's been a real pleasure.